Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Mark Jones. I'm a veterinarian and I'm head of policy at the Born Free Foundation, and I'm giving this presentation on behalf of myself and my colleague, our international policy specialist, Adeline Larambert. And I'd like to talk to you today about One Welfare and the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and in a wider context to explore why animal welfare matters for biodiversity protection and why consideration of animal welfare should be fully incorporated into relevant international agreements. First, a brief word about the organisation I'm representing today. Born Free was founded in 1984 by the actors Virginia McKenna, Bill Travers and their son Will. It's a UK-based international wildlife protection charity, and we promote compassionate conservation in order to enhance species survival, protect natural habitats, respect the needs and safeguard the welfare of individual animals, and ultimately to keep wildlife in the wild. As many of you will be aware, the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, entered into force in 1993 with three main objectives. They are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilisation of genetic resources. It's in the process of developing its post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which will replace the Aichi targets for biodiversity set out in its strategic plan for 2011 to 2020, none of which have been fully achieved. The Global Biodiversity Framework is really important since it will effectively establish international policy aimed at halting and reversing biodiversity loss for the coming decades, and by doing so inform strategy and policy at a regional and national level. The process of negotiating the goals, targets and indicators for the framework has been severely delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic, but is expected to culminate at the 15th conference of the parties to the CBD, now scheduled for spring 2022. Born Free, alongside like-minded organisations across the world, has been engaging with the process of development of the Global Biodiversity Framework from the outset. Among our key objectives for our engagement is to encourage the CBD and its member countries to integrate animal health and well-being into the goals, targets and indicators for the framework through the adoption of a One Health and One Welfare approach, with the rationale that such an approach is critical in order to reduce zoonotic disease risk and help tackle the biodiversity and by extension also the climate crisis. We are also seeking support for the reframing of the sustainable use narrative, which, as I indicated earlier, is one of the three core objectives of the CBD, through the incorporation of a recognition that in order to be considered sustainable, use of wildlife should be humane and should not compromise the well-being of any animal, in addition to it being demonstrably sustainable from a biological and ecological perspective. We believe that this would represent a significant change from the current highly anthropocentric definition of sustainable use and could serve to significantly improve outcomes for animal welfare, wildlife conservation and human and animal health. There is already significant recognition of the importance of incorporating animal welfare and well-being into international biodiversity policy among some influential actors at an international level. In the United Nations Sustainable Development Report in 2019, it stated strong governments should safeguard the well-being of both wildlife and domesticated animals, with rules on animal welfare embedded in international trade. And in Professor Dasgupta's final report to the UK Treasury following his team's review of the economics of biodiversity, he identified improvements in the enforcement and regulation of wildlife conservation, animal welfare and public health regulations among the solutions to reducing future pandemic risk. The current draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework contains goals, targets and milestones designed to set a path towards the ultimate vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. The goals are focused around the three core objectives of the CBD, with targets centred on increasing protected area coverage, controlling invasive species, reducing nutrient losses and pollutants, developing ecosystem-based climate change mitigation processes, eliminating incentives and subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity, and mobilising resources for biodiversity protection. The framework also incorporates a theory of change process, which is currently heavily focused on securing the integrity of ecosystems, preventing species extinctions and protecting genetic diversity in order to secure people's needs and ensure equitable sharing of the benefits to people from ecosystem services, with the ultimate goal of living in harmony with nature. Yet, critically, there's no specific reference to animal health or welfare in the first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and we believe it lacks the transformative changes to the business as usual paradigm that are vital if we are to avoid ecological collapse and the threat of future pandemics of zoonotic origin. So what's the rationale for incorporating animal welfare considerations into international biodiversity policy? Well, for a start, I think it's true to say that COVID-19 has really brought the risks that wildlife exploitation and consumption pose to human society to everybody's doorstep. Crowding, stress and injury among wild animals in trade provide the perfect environment for pathogens to spread and mutate. And the close proximity between animals and people during capture, farming, transportation, butchering, processing and trade creates many opportunities for disease transmission between individuals and species of both wild animals and domestic animals, and potentially onward transmission to people. So we believe that consideration of animal welfare is absolutely key to reducing zoonotic and pandemic risk, but we also believe it's vital to halting and reversing biodiversity loss. In this regard, there is increasing recognition of the complexity of animal culture and social structures, particularly among higher mammals. There's some really interesting work being undertaken on this under the auspices of the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, or CMS, which started with studies of sperm whales and now extends to other highly social taxa, including great apes and elephants. If our conservation efforts fail to recognise the importance of accounting for culture and social complexity among these and other species, they are likely to fail as the well-being of animals within populations reduces and their social integrity breaks down. So in order to try to incorporate these considerations into the Global Biodiversity Framework, we're promoting changes to key aspects of the current draft. First, we're promoting changes to the CBD's 2050 vision in order to incorporate respect for the intrinsic value of wildlife and biodiversity and the need to recognise that the implementation of the framework should aim to benefit all life on Earth, not just the lives of people. With specific reference to Target 5 in the current draft framework, which is on wildlife harvesting, trade and use, we're pushing for changes that would recognise that wildlife use should be well within ecologically sustainable limits and safe for human, animal and wider ecosystem health and well-being by encompassing the principles of One Health and One Welfare. And we're also pushing for improvements to other targets in the current draft framework, including Target 4 on species conservation and human-wildlife conflict by emphasising the importance of coexistence and respect for individual animals and their importance to wider ecosystem health and function. and target 6 on invasive alien species by promoting the need to minimise welfare harms through the application of, for example, the International Consensus Principles for Humane Wildlife Control, which was published by Dubois et al. In 2017. In terms of the opportunities we have to promote our recommendations, we've just been engaging in the latest open-ended working group meeting to discuss aspects of the first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and the output from that meeting will help to inform discussions going forward within that open-ended working group and within the technical bodies which advise the Convention on Biological Diversity, which are due to meet later this year or early next. Ultimately, the Global Biodiversity Framework will be presented to the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is due to take place in spring 2022, and which will consider the documentation that it receives for adoption and implementation. Ultimately, we believe that only through recognition of the inherent interlinkages between human, animal and environmental health and well-being, and the incorporation of One Welfare principles into international, regional and national policy, can we hope to tackle the crisis facing biodiversity and mitigate the future risks from zoonotic diseases and pandemics in order to provide a secure future for the people, animals and all life on Earth. So thank you for listening, and you can find further details of Born Free's calls for a transformative approach to nature's protection through the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework on our website. Thank you.